Gigabyte recently launched their new Aero 15X9 and Y9 laptops with Nvidia's latest RTX graphics. But how do these compare against the 2018 models? In this video, I'm going to compare the Aero 15X with 2070 Max-Q graphics with the newer Aero 15X9 with 2070 Max-Q graphics. We'll look at differences in gaming performance, thermals, battery life, laptop design, and more to help you decide which to get. First, let's cover the differences in specs between the two units I'm testing with. Essentially, they're the same, apart from the graphics. Both have an Intel i7-8750H CPU, a single 16GB stick of memory running at DDR4 2666, different brands, but same speed and timings. The new Aeros have what Gigabyte are calling their all-Intel solution. So they've got upgraded Intel wireless cards and also Intel SSDs, which offer better performance. They've got the same 94Wh battery, same 15.6-inch 1080p 144Hz screen, and the internals look identical too. Same heat pipes and two fans for cooling. There are only slight differences between chassis design. On the lid, we've got the same Gigabyte logo in the center, which lights up white with the carbon fiber pattern down the bottom. The interior looks the same too. I asked Gigabyte at CES if the same keyboard was in use with the newer model, and I was told that it was. The touchpads physically look and feel the same. However, out of the box, the new Aero uses precision drivers, something you'd have to manually change with the older model, so that's a welcome change. There's a battery icon on the lower right corner of the older model. You can press it while the laptop is off and it will show you the battery charge left with the lights on the front. However, this feature is not present with the newer X9 model. Both laptops have the same 720p camera down the bottom. This is what the camera on the Aero 15X looks like, and this is what the camera looks like in the newer X9. The I/O on the sides is a little different. On the left, the older Aero 15X has a physical mini DisplayPort 1.4 output, while the newer 15X9 has been updated to a USB 3.1 Type-C port, which has DisplayPort 1.4 support, so a bit more versatile as you can use it for both USB data transfer or a display output. You'll just need a USB Type-C cable instead of a mini DisplayPort cable. I/O on the right is exactly the same, no differences. The back is also the same, and the front looks similar. Again, just the difference of no status LEDs on the front of the new X9. The screens are both the same 15.6-inch 1080p 144Hz LG panel, although both are available with 4K panels, which have better color gamut, contrast ratio, and brightness, which would be recommended if you're using it for content creation rather than gaming. With the Aero 15X V8, the 1080p screen may be either AUO or LG, so you could get a different panel. However, now with the V9, they're only using the LG panel, so no surprises when you buy. In terms of color gamut, I did get slightly better results with the newer X9, although there is always variance between different panels, even in the same model. Another difference is that the new Aero laptops have Gigabyte's AI software installed. There are two modes, AI Edge and AI Cloud. AI Edge processes the data locally to make the best decisions in terms of what to change, like fan speed and power limits. While the AI Cloud setting will send data to Microsoft and get the best settings for the workload based on other user-submitted data, so I'm expecting it to perform better. Otherwise, all tests had the AI disabled unless stated otherwise. I did ask Gigabyte at CES whether this software would be available with the older V8 model and was told that it would not. However, I have not attempted to install it to see what happens. These are the results from my standard battery tests. I test with background apps disabled, keyboard lighting off, and the screen at 50% brightness. In the test where I just leave YouTube videos playing, both lasted for the exact same amount of time. While gaming, the older 15X lasted longer, which seems to indicate that the 1070 Max-Q graphics were using less power, as the test was the same and both were capped to 30 FPS. Next, let's get into some performance data. Both laptops were tested at the same time side by side under the same conditions, so all data is fresh and up to date. For example, while doing the temperature testing, both laptops had the same tests going at the same time for the same amount of time. Therefore, results are directly comparable. Let's start with the temperatures. Both laptops were tested together with a room temperature of 24 degrees Celsius, as it's summer here in Australia. And I think this information is critical to understand before we get into the gaming results. First, these are the CPU-only temperatures. These tests were done by running the AIDA64 stress test only at the same time on both laptops, so no combined GPU load yet. As we can see, with the exact same load applied, the temperatures on the newer Aero 15X9, shown by the blue bars, are hotter. I'm not exactly sure why this is. I don't know if they used different thermal paste, or if it was badly applied in my unit, because the heat pipes and cooling otherwise appear to be the same in both models. I did ask some others with both laptops about this, including Tim from Hardware Unboxed and Stephen from Own or Disown, and it seems like they don't have quite as big of a difference as me, so this may be an indication of an abnormality with my specific unit, but I can't be sure. I did notice that by default, the X9 was overvolted by 0.01 volts for some reason, which essentially sends it more power and may make it run a little warmer, but not by this much. These are the clock speeds from each laptop from these CPU-only tests. At stock, both were power limit throttling at their default 52 watt TDP. However, once undervolted, both were able to get about full boost speed from the i7-8750H. The X9 was almost there with this undervolt, but still had intermittent power limit throttling, which is why it was slightly behind. This could have been removed either by applying a more aggressive undervolt or boosting the power limit. However, while I found that possible, it further increased temperatures. It's worth noting that the older Aero 15X was running with a 49 watt TDP once undervolted in this test, while the X9 was capped at the 52 watt limit, so 3 watts higher. I found if I did boost the power limit of the X9 to fully remove power limit throttling, even with this undervolt, it would sit at 54 watts. So perhaps this TDP difference helps explain the hotter temperatures with the X9. I'm not sure why the i7 in the X9 needs more power and runs hotter in the same workload at the same clock speed. Perhaps the i7 in my X9 simply lost the silicon lottery and requires more power to run, resulting in more heat. But this still doesn't explain why other X9 laptops have the 0.01 volt overvolt applied. Now let's look at graphics-only tests. These are the temperatures of both laptops running the same Heaven benchmark with the same settings at maximum at the same time, so no CPU stress tests running here. The 2070 Max-Q in the X9 was consistently 10 degrees Celsius hotter than the 1070 Max-Q in the 15X. Likewise, these are the clock speeds from the same GPU-only tests, with the older 15X ahead. It's worth remembering that the clock speeds specified by Nvidia for 2070 laptops have ranges that are wider than the 1070 Max-Q, so seeing lower clock speeds with the 2070 is possible purely from that difference. At this point, I'm not sure if the 2070 Max-Q is genuinely hotter than the 1070 Max-Q, or if it's some sort of issue with my X9, as we did also see a heat increase with the CPU-only stress test, when I'd expect those results to be closer together. Now let's look at combined CPU and GPU workloads. As there's a lot of data here, we'll start with the CPU results. These are the CPU temperatures while either playing Watch Dogs 2 for the gaming results, or running the Ada64 stress test with the Heaven benchmark at the same time for the stress test results, a worst case scenario. Just to clarify, these are now the results from running combined CPU and GPU workloads, both running together at the same time. I'm just showing the CPU results first. Before, we saw either CPU or GPU running at once. UV means a CPU undervolt, the same minus 0.12 volts was used as before, and the same 90 MHz overclock for the graphics was used on both laptops too. I was able to overclock the 1070 Max-Q a bit more, but decided to use the same 90 MHz that was stable on my 2070 Max-Q to try and keep the effects similar. In all tests, we can see that the CPU is the same temperature, except at idle where the older Aero was a little cooler. As the AI software is only available for the new RTX laptops, the 15X will always be reported as 0. These are the clock speeds of the CPU for the same tests just shown. In all tests, we can see that the older Aero 15X, shown by the green bars, was getting higher clock speeds in this combined test. This is because the newer Aero 15X9 was thermal throttling more. So although both were hitting the same 90 degrees Celsius cap, the newer X9 wasn't performing as well as a result, possibly due to increased heat being added into the system from the RTX 2070 Max-Q graphics. But as we saw before, the CPU is also hotter in my X9. These are the GPU temperatures from the same tests, so still with the combined CPU and GPU load. In all tests, the 2070 Max-Q graphics in the newer Aero 15X9, shown by the blue bars, were running hotter when compared with the 1070 Max-Q in the older Aero 15X, shown by the green bars. 86 degrees Celsius was the point where thermal throttling was hit on the graphics, which was happening in the X9 unless the fan was set to full speed. These are the clock speeds for the same tests just shown. Again, in most cases, the green bars for the older Aero 15X were ahead as it was running cooler. However, as discussed earlier, the 2070 Max-Q has lower clock speeds compared to the 1070 Max-Q. That's just how Nvidia are offering it though, so not too surprising. Overall, the newer Aero 15X9 is running hotter, resulting in lower CPU clock speeds. The The lower GPU clock speeds are likely a result of the 2070 Max-Q graphics just not being clocked as high as the 1070 Max-Q, at least according to Nvidia specifications. However, we did see GPU throttling under combined CPU and GPU stress tests on the X9, a worst case scenario. But again, there is extra heat from the CPU which I haven't really been able to explain. Unlike the older 15X, the newer X9 is also available with the overclockable i9-8950HK CPU. The Y9 model is also available with 2080 Max-Q graphics, so there is more power available. Given the thermal throttling here with the i7 and 2070 Max-Q, that would definitely be the case with the higher spec models too. However, it's worth remembering that these tests are basically worst case scenarios. For the majority of everyday workloads, I think the higher spec options should still perform better. With all of that in mind, let's take a look at the gaming results. All games were tested with the fans at maximum speed with dual channel memory for best performance. I used the same memory in each laptop, so there was 32GB running at DDR4 2666 in dual channel. I'll also just note quickly that I had memory compatibility issues with both, as covered in my Aero upgrade video, so I'm thinking the new one seems as picky as its predecessor. I want to start out with Dota 2, as the results drive home an important point you need to keep in mind when looking at the rest of the upcoming game results. I tested this with the exact same replay, however I find the test to be CPU bound, so due to my X9 having a higher degree of CPU throttling, it's actually coming out slightly behind when compared to the older 15X in this test. Shadow of the Tomb Raider on the other hand is an example where the difference in GPU makes more of a difference, particularly at higher settings where we become less reliant on the CPU. It was tested with the built-in benchmark, and with the highest settings in use, the 2070 Max-Q was getting 18% higher average frame rates over the 1070 Max-Q. Battlefield 5 was tested in campaign mode, as it's easier to consistently reproduce the test run on both laptops. I've also added the RTX results in green, which I of course could only test on the RTX 2070 Max-Q, and I only found it playable at low and medium settings. Outside of RTX though, the 2070 Max-Q in the X9 was ahead in most tests. At ultra settings, it was getting 9% higher average FPS compared to the 1070 Max-Q in the 15X. Far Cry 5 was also tested using the built-in benchmark, and there's much less of a difference between the two here. At ultra settings, the 2070 Max-Q was getting just 3% higher average FPS, while the 1% lows were actually lower on the X9, likely due to that CPU throttling. I tend to find lower CPU performance reduces frame times and causes this result, so it makes sense here. The Witcher 3 was tested with Hairworks disabled and saw a nice boost in performance with the 2070 Max-Q. At ultra settings, it was getting a massive 32% higher average FPS, the biggest improvement out of all 14 games tested. There was a decent improvement to the 1% lows in this title too, with an 18% improvement at ultra settings. Ghost Recon is a resource-intensive game and was tested with the built-in benchmark. In these tests, the 2070 Max-Q was always ahead in terms of average FPS. However, the gap widens at higher setting levels as we become more GPU bound. At ultra settings, the 2070 Max-Q was getting 13% higher average FPS, and this was the only setting where the 1% low was higher. Watch Dogs 2 was another resource-intensive game that was basically always maxing out the CPU, which is why I think we're seeing worse results from the 2070 Max-Q in this game at all settings. At ultra settings, the 1070 Max-Q was getting 2% higher average FPS than the 2070 Max-Q, while at low settings this increases to the 1070 Max-Q scoring 19% higher average FPS. Assassin's Creed Odyssey was tested using the built-in benchmark, and the 1070 Max-Q was ahead in all tests except at ultra settings, where the 2070 Max-Q came out 8% ahead in terms of average FPS. However, the X9 was always slightly behind when it came to 1% low results, again most likely due to the heavier CPU throttling noted earlier. Doom was tested using Vulkan, and in this game the 2070 Max-Q was ahead in the majority of tests, only coming out slightly behind at low settings. At ultra settings, the X9 was getting 7% higher average FPS and 8% higher 1% low. Fortnite was tested with the replay feature, so the exact same replay was used on both laptops. This was another game where the X9's 2070 Max-Q was only coming out ahead in terms of average FPS at max settings. In this case, at epic settings, it was 11% ahead of the 1070 Max-Q in the 15X. CSGO was tested with the Ulletical FPS benchmark, and I have noticed that this is another test that seems to favour CPU power, which I believe explains why the older 1070 Max-Q is so far ahead in average frame rate. With all settings at maximum, the 1070 Max-Q was getting 20% higher average FPS over the 2070 Max-Q. Overwatch was tested in the practice range, as it allowed me to perform the exact same test run on both laptops. In all tests, the 2070 Max-Q was coming out ahead here, both for average frame rate and 1% low. At epic settings, the 2070 Max-Q in the X9 was getting a 10% higher average FPS, and an 8% improvement to 1% low. PUBG was tested using the exact same replay on both laptops, and the 2070 Max-Q was behind in almost all tests, with the exception being Ultra settings, where it was coming out 6% ahead in terms of average FPS. Rainbow Six Siege was tested with the built-in benchmark, and there were pretty big improvements in this test across the board with the X9. I suspect this is more due to the RTX Turing architecture though. As in other videos where I've compared the GTX against RTX graphics, this game usually sees the largest improvement on the RTX option. With Ultra settings, the 2070 Max-Q was scoring 22% higher average FPS and 1% low. I've also tested 3D Mark Firestrike, TimeSpy, and VR Mark, both with dual-channel memory configurations, and in most cases, the 2070 Max-Q in the X9 was ahead in these tests. This is a summary of all 14 games tested at 1080p with the highest setting level in use. I've used the highest setting level because, as we saw, in general, there was the most improvement with the 2070 Max-Q there, as we become less CPU bound. On average, across all games, the 2070 Max-Q was performing 8.3% higher in average frame rate compared to the 1070 Max-Q. And if we remove that extreme CSGO result, it's 10.2% better. But as we can see, it really depends on the game. The higher degree of CPU throttling in my X9 seemed to cause some performance loss, as was made obvious in the games where the CPU played a more important role, or at lower settings where the graphics are utilized less. I think this shows that if the CPU on the newer X9 could be run cooler, then it should be possible to improve performance further. Modifications such as undervolting would help. However, as we also saw in the temperature testing, it did not entirely remove CPU throttling from the equation in a combined CPU and GPU workload. Due to the CPU throttling differences, you should not use the data presented here as a proper comparison between 1070 Max-Q and 2070 Max-Q graphics. It should only be used as a way of comparing the Aero 15X against the newer Aero 15X9, and even then the CPU-only temperatures are raising suspicion. I don't know if the X9 results are unique to my unit or if it's really that much hotter for some reason. Outside of gaming, I mostly use my personal Aero 15X for editing videos while I'm traveling. At CES, I made about 13 4K videos for the channel, for example. I did a test export for one of my recent videos using CUDA acceleration, and the GPU difference didn't really help. The 15X still completed the task faster as I find the videos I personally create to rely more on the CPU. So that extra CPU throttling in the X9 is making that process slower. For updated pricing, check the links in the description, as prices will change over time. At the time of recording, the new Aero 15X9 with 2070 Max-Q graphics can be picked up for $2,400 US, while the slightly older Aero 15X with 1070 Max-Q graphics goes for $200 less at $2,200 US. As the 15X has been around for a bit now, you might also be able to find a good secondhand deal. So basically, there's a 9% difference for the new Aero 15X9. Is it worth it? I think it could be. Let me explain. Purely in terms of game performance, I was seeing about an 8% overall improvement to average FPS in the 14 games I tested, although it was over 10% removing CSGO from the equation. Paying 9% more for that much extra performance in games sounds reasonable to me if you want it. As we've seen, the X9 was running hotter, and while the 2070 Max-Q graphics were about 10 degrees Celsius hotter compared to the 1070 Max-Q, I also saw the CPU-only test run hotter on the X9. And given both laptops have the same cooling solution, I'm not sure if there's a thermal paste difference or otherwise some problem specific to my unit. So you'll have to take my temperature results with a grain of salt. Outside of gaming, with the newer X9 you also get the better Intel Wi-Fi card, which is up to twice as fast. While the Intel SSD is also faster, but also 1TB, so double the size of the 512GB one in the older Aero 15X. So which laptop would you guys pick? The older Aero 15X or newer Aero 15X9? Overall, the X9 has some nice incremental improvements, such as precision touchpad drivers, faster Wi-Fi, and larger SSD. But otherwise, for the most part, the design of the laptop is the same. The major difference is of course Nvidia's latest RTX graphics, which are available in the newer models, with up to i9 CPUs. Although, as we saw, the newer model was running hotter. Despite this though, on average in the games I've tested, there was a fair performance boost with the 2070 Max-Q graphics, which may make it a worthy option if you're looking at buying it for gaming. Outside of gaming, if you don't need RTX graphics, it may make more sense to get the older 15X. unless you really want those new improvements for the $200. Either way, I'm still very happy with my 15X and don't need the newer X9. Let me know which one you'd go for and why down in the comments. And if you're new here, get subscribed for future tech videos like this one.